Alrighty, you know the drill. I've seen a couple of my friends on YouTube do this tier ranking video of horror subgenres. So of course I want to weigh in because I love giving my opinion on things. That's why we're here. All right, first and foremost, let's talk about the ranking system. I'm gonna be ranking these subgenres on like two main things: how scary I find movies typically within that subgenre, and how excited I get about a movie if I hear it falls into one of these subgenres. So we're gonna go with your typical tier ranking list structure. The S tier for me is the hype is real. Like, those are ones scare me to death. If I hear a new movie is coming out in that subgenre, I'm there, no questions asked. A tier, I am sat. It's great, it's awesome, I'm sat. I am sat in the theater, my butt's in the theater. B tier, it's up there. Maybe not my all-time favorites, but they're up there. And then C tier is true middle of the road, it's hit or miss. D tier is just not for me. Like, these are ones that I can acknowledge the greats, I can acknowledge what it does well, but overall just not my jam. E tier is mostly mediocre, so I dislike more than I like within this subgenre. And then finally F tier, it's the bottom, so it's a no for me. And within each subgenre, I will give my top 3-ish horror movies within that subgenre. Also, you could play a super fun and very dangerous drinking game while watching this video. Take a drink every time I say subgenre. I think I've said it about like 7 times already. All right, let's go in alphabetical order just because. So first up is action horror. And if we want to get technical, the definition of action horror is the combination of an evil force, event, or supernatural thing with gunfights, frantic chases, etc. You know, it's horror with action. I feel like this is kind of a rare category for horror, I guess, in the way that most people think of an action horror, because I feel like you could argue that most horror movies are action. Like, they have elements of action to them. There's often confrontational fights with like the monster or the antagonist. Obviously lots of violence, often weapons used. I think these movies, at least the ones that come to mind for me, are more thrilling than they are scary. But when I hear about one, I can't deny that I'm intrigued to watch it because, like I said, we don't really get these very often. And for that, I think I'm putting this one in the hit or miss side. Middle of the road. My top 3 recommendations for action horror movies: Upgrade, Green Room, Underworld. Next is anthology horror. I think one of my most used phrases, or most repeated phrases in my 10 years on YouTube has got to be, I love a good anthology. But it is true, I do love a good anthology. I love short form horror, both in books and in movies. I think there's a beauty in kind of restricting the amount of time you give yourself to tell a scary story. And anthologies go especially hard for me when there's like an overall theme to the anthology or some sort of fun connecting factor. This one is tricky when it comes to rating the scare factor of each movie because anthologies inherently have multiple short horror films within them, a lot of times from different directors. But I can't deny that when I hear about a new horror anthology, I am very excited, and I think that outweighs the overall scare factor a little bit. So to reconcile those two feelings, I'm gonna put it in the A tier. Like, I am definitely sat for a new horror anthology. Recommendations for that one, the list could go on, but if I had to narrow it down: Trick or Treat, Southbound, Tales from the Hood, and Creepshow. All right, body horror. By definition, horror fiction in which the horror is principally derived from the unnatural graphic transformation, degeneration, or destruction of the physical body. This can be disease, deformity, parasites, mutilations, mutations, so many iterations. And this is kind of like the opposite of anthology horror for me, where I find body horror quite terrifying, like most of the time, because the horror is coming from like this over exaggeration of like real viruses, diseases, intense body functions like giving birth, and so on and so forth. So it's inherently uncomfortable to watch, that's the point. But I can't say I'm always excited to watch new body horror. It really depends. It depends on the subject. So I think I'll put this in the B category. Like, it's up there for me. Hey, B for body horror. My picks for this are Tusk, of course, American Mary, and Frankenhooker. Side note from editor Vicky, I'm editing this after having seen The Substance, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention The Substance is now one of my new top body horror picks because it was that amazing. Next is Christmas horror. I freaking love Christmas horror. The Christmas season is so fucking weird. It's like everybody acknowledges that the season is terrible. It's stressful, the stores are overcrowded, literally all the time. Everyone is miserable, and yet everybody is still like participating in that to chase this lovely feeling of being around your favorite people, the good food, the pretty lights, the cozy vibes. And I feel like Christmas horror barely even has to stretch to exaggerate these emotions. And boy, do I love the juxtaposition of Christmas iconography and blood, guts, gore, scary things. It's safe to say that I will prioritize seeing a Christmas horror when I hear of one that I haven't seen yet. So this has got to be S tier for me. My recommendations within Christmas horror are Krampus, Black Christmas, the original from 1974, The Lodge, and Rare Exports. All right, next up in alphabetical order is comedy horror. This one's a tricky one because like horror, comedy is so varied and so subjective. And just within comedy horror in general, I like it's so varied, like it truly is a spectrum. Some are more comedy heavy, others are more horror heavy. I do love this subgenre though. I feel like there's something really powerful about being in a dark theater with a bunch of strangers watching a scary movie, and when a part gets you, you know, and you jump out of your seat or you scream, you get a good chuckle out of it. So I think there is power in finding the funny in a scary situation, and I think the mechanics behind making somebody jump and making somebody laugh are pretty much the same. It's all just a setup and a punchline. But because it is so varied, I can't say that I'm necessarily excited just by hearing about a new horror comedy. Again, it just depends on what it's about. So this genre is A tier for me. My top picks for comedy horror are Beetlejuice, Lisa Frankenstein, What We Do in the Shadows, and Housebound. Okay, so far we've kept exclusively to the top half of this this tier ranking chart, and that is about to change with cosmic horror. The subgenre is defined as an emphasis on the horror of the unknowable and incomprehensible more than gore or other elements of shock. It's also known as Lovecraftian horror or Eldritch horror. And I feel like this is an acquired taste subgenre. For me, I feel like these movies are usually like pretty trippy on some level, and I'm not always into that. Plus, I hold an active hatred for H.P. Lovecraft. So anything related to him, I usually keep at arm's length at best. But I think it's safe to say I'm pretty much never excited about a new cosmic horror movie. So my three picks are pretty much the only ones I will go to bat for. But when it comes to this subgenre, it's a no from me, which I find it weird to give suggestions on the subgenre where I'm like, I hate this. But here they are anyway. Underwater, In the Mouth of Madness, and Event Horizon. Creature features are next. The definition online is super simple. It's a horror movie that features a monster. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I keep animals and creatures like separate in my horror book. So I think that a true blue creature is something other, like not dinosaurs, not sharks, etc. Nothing that's real or has been real. And don't worry, I will talk about animal horror in a later subgenre. But let's just talk about monsters. Monsters are fun. There's a lot of creativity to be had there, especially when there's not a kind of agreed upon way that a thing should look, like with werewolves or vampires. And depending on the message or societal fear being conveyed in the movie, the monster reflecting that can lead to some super scary stuff. The scariness for me definitely depends on the monster, as does my excitement for the movie. So I feel like creature features are probably hit or miss for me, if I'm being honest. There's just so much variation, but when it hits, it hits. And my 3 absolute favorites within this subgenre are Attack the Block, Creature from the Black Lagoon, and The Descent. All right, dystopian horror. I've seen some videos where they separate apocalypse horror and dystopian horror. I'm going to talk about them together. I'm including apocalypse horror within dystopian because I feel like they go hand in hand, honestly. Like, one just comes before the other. You have the apocalypse, and then whatever is left of society that follows is the dystopia, you know? I think I can say very confidently that I have no excitement for dystopian stories of any kind, especially right now. I've lived this far into my life and so many once in a generation events. Like we're living through it. I can't say I'm excited necessarily to confront those anxieties that I have in dystopian stories. And let's be real, let's be honest. I feel like every dystopian story is pretty much saying the same thing about humanity and how we treat each other. Like, I feel like there's not a lot of variation in there when it comes to like the deep themes. So this is an E tier for me. My top 3 picks for dystopian horror are A Quiet Place, The Purge, and Doomsday. So I mentioned that I don't count like animal horror within creature features. And that's because I feel like animal horror belongs with eco horror. To me, they go hand in hand. Because eco-horror movies include mention of ecological issues and environmental topics, which I feel like the animals that inhabit the ecosystem are a part of that. Or at the very least, these movies have some sort of natural element to them, which again, I feel like goes hand in hand with animals. Now, these are not always bangers for me. I feel like some of them can be quite silly and not in a fun way for me, but some of them can be really unsettling as well because of the real world topics, especially when it comes to like climate change and our effect as humans on the planet. So whether I'm hyped up hearing about a eco-horror movie, again, depends on the topic and whether I really want to confront how much humans suck in any given moment. So sometimes it depends on how close to reality it really is. So I think these are hit or miss for me, but my favorites are The Host, Godzilla -1, and The Birds. Oh, folk horror, how I love these. I love folk horror so much. I love the vibes. A lot of times I feel like these movies are super slow burning and super moody. As a water sign, I very much appreciate that moodiness. I think this subgenre is a very close sibling to occult horror, which I will talk about later. They have a lot of commonalities. But what I really love about folk horror is a return to nature. There's always some sort of extremely rural area or isolated place and some poor city person that stumbles in and is reminded just how scary the countryside, woods, whatever can be. The creep level, always up there for me. And I am always hyped to see new folk horror movies come out. So this is God tier, this is S tier. My absolute favorites, if I had to choose, The Wailing, The Witch, Men, and The Wicker Man, the original from 1973. All right, next up is found footage. In my early YouTube days, I feel like in retrospect, I just had like a long stint with some really bad found footage horror movies. And I was convinced that I just didn't like them, like as a whole, like any found footage horror movie. But when I really stopped to think about it, I was like, there's so many that I love and have watched multiple times. I do think it is a subgenre that can be overdone. There's a lot of cliches that get old really fast. However, as technology evolves and how we use technology to like document our experiences and share them with people keeps the subgenre fresh in a really interesting way that I don't necessarily think happens with all of these subgenres. And as such, there have been some really unique, like truly lightning in a bottle horror movies that have come from this subgenre. And I think if I'm being so real, if I'm being so honest, found footage horror movies are up there for me. Like, it's in the up there category. I always want them to be good, so I make a point to watch them. And the ones that I do love scare me to death, honestly. Like, some of the scariest horror movies I've ever seen are found footage horror movies. Like the real like rawness of the subgenre can make for some horrifying content. It's just not quite at the top because of those bad ones. Some of the bad ones are truly just really bad. But my top picks in this subgenre are As Above, So Below, The Blair Witch Project, Lake Mungo, and Paranormal Activity. I think I just really love horror movies, you guys. Almost nothing is at the bottom of this tier ranking so far. All right, ghost stories are a classic horror subgenre. And if you think about it, I feel like so many horror movies can technically fall into this category. For the purposes of this ranking though, I'm gonna stick to just regular ghost stories. So anything that is going to possibly make me not able to relax at home, like a malevolent force, is a no from me. I'm a homebody, I love my creature comforts, and I hate things that disrupt that. So in that sense, I hate ghost stories or haunted house movies because they make me afraid of my own house. And by hate, I mean I love, because they're super scary, and that's the whole point of watching a horror movie. What do we watch horror for if not to confront our own fears, right? And they are usually pretty much a guaranteed solid watch. It's hard to truly mess up a haunted house movie, you know? Like you really have to try. So I feel like this has got to be A tier for me. My top picks would be Ghost Watch, The Haunting in Connecticut, The Innkeepers, and The Frighteners. I can already tell you right now there's gonna be no suspense to this one. Gothic horror is S tier. I feel like Gothic horror is, like ghost stories, another tried and true subgenre. The vibes are always immaculate, and I am always hyped to watch one, whether it's a new one or an old favorite. I feel like these can often go hand in hand with ghost stories and hauntings. It's a big theme within Gothic horror. But then you also have like the decayed setting, themes of isolation, confinement. There's usually some sort of like secret being kept or being hidden. You know the deal. And this one's kind of an outlier because I don't always find Gothic horror movies the scariest, and I know I said I was ranking based on that, but I just love them so much that I can't not put them at the top. It was hard to pick some favorites, but I have to go with Crimson Peak, The Orphanage, and The Others. All right, so I can confidently say that home invasion horror movies are probably the scariest types of horror movies to me. As I said about the ghost / haunting subgenre, I'm a homebody, so anything that kind of disrupts my comfort at home terrifies me, and home invasion is like the ultimate kind of disruption of the safety of being at home. And somebody breaking into my house is probably my biggest rational fear. And it's usually because a very common theme in home invasion horror movies is this like just because reasoning for doing so that makes it feel like it could happen at any time for no reason at all. So I'm definitely scared by these movies, but I wouldn't say I'm excited to watch them because I know they are going to freak me out too badly. The timing has to usually be right for me to watch one or want to watch one. And if I'm being honest, it's gonna be like the middle of the day when other people are home, or at the very least, I know somebody else is gonna be home at night. So I think I'm gonna put this one in the B tier. My favorites, i.e. some movies that scared the absolute fuck out of me, are The Strangers, Incident in a Ghostland, Hush, and Inside from 2007. All right, next up is occult horror. This subgenre for me encompasses witchy movies, basically anything that explores beliefs and practices that are outside of mainstream religion and science. Like I said earlier, I feel like this subgenre has a lot of overlap with folk horror. So that means already it's gonna be on the higher end of this ranking. So that means this is gonna be on the higher end of this ranking, which might come as a shock to you because I've rated almost nothing in the top half of this chart. I love these movies and I find them pretty scary most of the time because I feel like they often deal with older gods, ancient beings, and like just really old powers, and that's super freaky to me. Like dealing with things that have been around for like longer than anything else has been around is just terrifying. But satanic panic type of movies also technically fall under occult horror. In those movies, Christianity is usually the hero, which I get because Satan only exists within Christianity, but still. So I would say occult horror is A tier for me. I'm definitely sat. And my favorites within this subgenre are House of the Devil, Pyewacket, The Black Coat's Daughter, and Suspiria from 2018. I feel like I'm gonna get a lot of hate for that one. All right, possession horror. I feel like that one's super straightforward. You know the deal. Usually involves some sort of demon, often used as a metaphor for mental illness, unfortunately. Either that or puberty. I gotta say, I don't really care much for possession horror movies. I haven't seen many of them do anything different or unique with the subject. They all just kind of hit the same notes for me with very few exceptions. So I can't say I really get excited to watch them. And I feel like this is gonna be a not for me pick. Like, there are some really good ones that I really enjoy, but overall, just not for me. But my ultimate favorites within the subgenre are The Devil's Candy, Hereditary, Noroi the Curse, and The Exorcism of Emily Rose. All right, this next one. I feel like psychological horror is kind of hard for me to identify. And I think that's because I feel like pretty much every horror movie could fall into this category. So I think in my own head, I tend to categorize horror movies into other things first before I say this is just a straight up psychological horror. So just for clarity, the definition of a psychological horror movie focuses on mental, emotional, and psychological states to frighten, disturb, or unsettle its audience. Okay, yeah, that's still super vague. Just from looking at what the internet says psychological horror movies are, like the examples that they give, I like these movies. I think I'm just going to put this subgenre in the middle because I genuinely don't initially ever think like, oh look, a new psychological horror movie is coming out. But looking at the examples, a lot of them are terrifying and I really enjoy them. So yeah, middle of the road for lack of a better place on this chart in this system that I created, you know, so I did this to myself. So my favorites, according to the internet definition, are Get Out, Black Swan, and Psycho. All right, next up is religious horror, and I feel like this is the antithesis to occult horror, I suppose, anyway. No, I actually do love religious horror movies, especially because a lot of them kind of take the route of critiquing toxic aspects of Christianity. I think those make for really compelling horror movies, especially nowadays. But mostly I find a lot of religious horror movies kind of similar to possession horror movies in that they kind of all hit the same notes. Like everyone is gonna hit those cliches. I kind of know exactly how it's gonna go and how it's gonna end. So I wouldn't necessarily say I get excited when a new religious horror movie is announced, but they do have the capacity to scare me, depending on what the movie might be about more specifically. So I suppose this is a mostly mediocre. I kind of just feel like I have to put something on this tier, you know? My top picks for this category are The First Omen, The Sacrament, and Saint Maud. We are nearing the end of this list here, and if you are still here, I love you. I'm not sure how long this is gonna end up being, but I know it's gonna be longer than my normal videos, so. And my throat is definitely not hurting with all this talking right now. Next up is sci-fi horror. I feel like as technology has progressed, this subgenre has become so much more than just horror that takes place in space or horror involving aliens. Like now I feel like there's a lot more horror involving AI, something that I think is just gonna become more and more prevalent. But being honest, I don't really get excited for new sci-fi horror, and I don't necessarily get scared by it. Maybe more so when it involves like aliens or other beings coming to Earth. That's pretty scary. But I'll never go to space, so I really have nothing to fear about anything happening out there. Like, I'm never gonna be out there. It's only when it comes here. And the AI stuff is scary for sure, but I don't really use any of that stuff intentionally. So until it becomes more prevalent and we're all using it kind of really without intending to, I'm chill. So I'm gonna put this in the not for me category. I know. I do genuinely feel like I could talk myself into rating all of these subgenres so much higher. So I'm trying to go off of gut instinct here to make it a little varied. My favorites within sci-fi horror are Alien, The Thing, and Megan. All right, down to the last 5 subgenres, or at least the subgenres that I chose to talk about today. You knew slashers was gonna be on here. This is another classic horror subgenre. I feel like I don't need to explain or define this one. And I feel like actually like slasher movies, I think, are what non-horror fans think of when they think of a horror movie. And for that, I think that makes slashers like one of the most accessible subgenres in horror. Like, even non-horror fans know the cliches of a slasher movie. It's so prevalent in pop culture now. Weirdly, and sound off in the comments if you experience this too, I often don't think of newer slasher movies as slashers right away. Like, there's a part of my brain that hears the word slasher and I think exclusively of like 80s, 90s slasher cycle. I don't know if I'm alone in that or if that makes any sense. Anyway, so I guess I don't really get hyped for new slashers then, because I'm genuinely not thinking of new slashers as a slasher movie. The more I say it, the less it makes sense, but it makes sense in my head. Now, meta slasher, I still love. If I hear about any one of those, I'm getting excited. So there is some hype there. I don't watch these to get scared though, to be honest. I feel like slasher movies are more comfort movies to me than anything now. Like, I have too much fun with them to be scared anymore. But anything below a B tier feels wrong to me for this subgenre, so I'm gonna go with B tier. It's up there for me. My favorites, of course, are Scream, X, and Bodies. Those latter two is a good example of, like, I just don't think of them as slasher movies, but by definition, they are. Do you know what I mean? Okay, I'm gonna stop talking about that. Next one is one that if you've watched this channel for a little while, I know you're not expecting this to be in the top half of this chart, and that is splatter films. Splatter films are defined by the deliberate focus on graphic portrayals of gore and graphic violence. These films often display a fascination with the vulnerability of the human body and the theatricality of its mutilation. I do not seek out these movies ever. Most that I've watched for some other purpose outside of me wanting to. It's just not something that I usually want to see. Now, there are some goofier horror movies that technically fall into this category by definition and that I do like, but they are the extreme exception. I think it's pretty clear that splatter goes on the bottom of the list for me. But my picks, my two exceptions, are Brain Dead / Dead Alive and Deathgasm. Vampire horror movies, another horror staple. They are classic. They are some of the first horror movies ever made. And for that, I feel like they at least command some respect. Throughout time, they've been used to represent so many topics. They are really so versatile. And I think that's why they kind of have staying power. Obviously, my personal favorite iterations of vampires are ones that are used to represent being queer. This I cannot deny. And vampire movies operate unintentionally like K-pop groups. I feel like they have comebacks every so often, and then periods where they aren't as active, like where we're not getting as many vampire movies. So when it starts to become apparent that we're getting another vampire cycle, I get excited. And I don't want to be presumptuous, but I feel like we are in the beginning of a new vampire cycle comeback right now. So for a vampire movie, I am absolutely sat. I am there. My all-time favorites are Nosferatu, the original from 1922, 30 Days of Night, A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, and The Vampire Lovers. We can't talk about vampire movies without also talking about werewolf movies. They basically go hand in hand, especially in the sense that my favorite depiction of werewolf movies, like vampire movies, are the queer ones. I always say that werewolves belong to the girls, gays, and theys. I just think it's the most thematically compelling way to do werewolves. And I feel like we hardly ever get werewolf movies, so I think I get hyped for new ones by default, just because they feel more rare somehow. But when I think about it, like when I go to look for specific examples of werewolf horror movies, I don't feel like I truly love many of them, if any of them. I just like a lot of them. So I think these actually have to be in hit or miss. My absolute favorites are Ginger Snaps, The Company of Wolves, and Cursed. All right, last but not least, zombies, the undead. How terrifying I find zombie movies entirely depends on the type of zombie. Like super slow, the dead have risen types aren't really scary, but fast ones or virus zombies are definitely scary. Zombies have also been used a lot thematically to represent a lot of different things, like from the more literal interpretations about pandemics to the more abstract, like how consumerism has made society zombie-like. They really are so versatile, actually. I can't say I get really excited for new zombie horror movies lately. I think that's in part due to the pandemic, and Honestly, this will be like a really weird kind of specific call out, like The Walking Dead and the insane amount of spin-offs of that show. Like, it just feels like oversaturation. Like, I'm a little burnt out on zombies. But overall, I feel like zombie movies are hit or miss for me. The ones that are good are so good, but the ones that are bad, like, I can't be bothered. Like, they're just so boring. So my top picks for this category would be One Cut of the Dead, Dawn of the Dead from 2004, and Train to Busan. That was a super long video. Let me know how you would rank these subgenres in the comments. Might be kind of hard without typing a lot, so maybe if you just want to like rank them all from top to bottom, or just tell me like what your S tier subgenres are. I would love to hear about it. I will see you soon with a new video. Until then, stay strange. Bye.